All right, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Liz Gillis, who's well known to many of us as an historian. She worked, I remember the first time I heard her speak was in Kilmainham, I think, not that long ago. She wasn't a prisoner, she was a guide. She's now working for South Dublin County Council in commemorations work. She's published many books. She's been involved in both television and radio production extensively. And amongst her works, I should mention the Fall of Dublin and Women of the Irish Revolution. I'll hand over to her now. Thanks, Liz.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and I'd just like to say a huge thank you to Military Archives and to the Military History Society for the invitation to speak today. So to start with, this photograph, it's very powerful. A staged photograph it looks like, but just that poster that we see, Easter week repeats itself, and really it does sum up the Battle for Dublin in 1922. But the forecourts, it was occupied in the early hours of the 14th of April 1922. We've heard of the convention taking place in March 22, and the anti-treaty IRA had been based in Barry's Hotel, in and around also Parnell Square, and then they decided to take over and occupy the forecourts, which they did with ease, it must be said, simply climbed over the gates. And this, if we understand or can imagine at that time, the forecourt is a hugely symbolic building. It's the last, if I'm not mistaken, building that wasn't destroyed in the previous year's 1916 War of Independence. So it is a huge symbol, and it is taken over easily, and the provisional government, they are not in a position to act, or are they? And if they are, why don't they? But they weren't. And we have the words of Pádraig O'Connor here, who was a veteran of the War of Independence, member of F Company 4th Battalion, had been a member of the Active Service Unit, one of the few members of the 4th Battalion to go pro-treaty. And he sums it up very clearly why the provisional government could not act at this time. And he says, we numbered 800 all ranks. The 2nd Eastern Division was 500. With the 200 from Kilkenny, it was reckoned we would have 1,000 men available in Dublin to oppose this force. The irregulars had in Dublin an estimated force of 3,000 men, and there was in the country a force of 20 to 30,000 men. It was hardly likely that the HQ staff would remain in the forecourts to be bottled up, nor was it likely that they would allow us to defeat their Dublin force and gain undisputed control of the city. So you can see they are outnumbered by very, very experienced men. And as the previous speaker mentioned, the anti-treaty side were now very well armed thanks to the capture of the Upnor arms ship. But also at that time, they could not, or the National Army could not actually rely on the loyalty of the soldiers, because right up until that moment when the attack begins on the forecourts, you do have members of the National Army either mutinying or switching sides, and they do take the anti-treaty side. But then what were the forces in the forecourts doing? Because they're in the forecourts for over 2 months, from mid-April to the attack in June. This is what they were doing. Now, these photographs, and these are from Kilmainham Jail, they do not show a group of people who are preparing for a war, preparing for a conflict. Now, we have them here with the armoured car, the Mutineer, which was captured, and that is key to the battle, to the fighting that takes place in and around the forecourts. And here we have Paddy O'Brien, who was the commanding officer of the forecourts garrison. Unlucky for him, you have a lot of the executive of the anti-treaty IRA that are stationed in the forecourts when the fighting actually begins. And then this other photograph of them on top of the forecourts with not many sandbags, it has to be said. And then I love this photograph, courtesy of Military Archives, of Paddy Rigney, another member of F Company 4th Battalion, and he's not actually shooting at someone, he is posing on top of the forecourts. And they do not utilise the time, but that also shows us that both sides were reluctant. Did they think that the conflict was inevitable? By these photographs, it clearly shows they didn't. Now, we've also heard that you have the pressure being put on by the British on Collins to act, and really Collins could not be seen to be act at the hands of the British, but the situation presents itself when we have the arrest of Leo Henderson, who was enforcing the Belfast boycott. He sets out from the forecourts, he goes to Ferguson's garage in Bagastry. There is a raid. These are photographs from the newspapers of that raid, and Henderson is arrested. And in response to this, it is then decided that the Anti-Treaty IRA will kidnap a very high-profile target who turns out to be Ginger O'Connell, and he is then taken to the forecourts. And it seems that that is the moment that Collins needs, and the ultimatum is sent to the forecourts garrison by Tom Ennis. And here we have the request or the demand that was sent in. The officer in charge, Forecourts I, acting under the order of the government, hereby order you to evacuate the buildings of the forecourts and to parade your men under arrest without arms on that portion of the quays immediately in front of the forecourts by 4 a.m. And this is the early hours of the 28th of June. Failing compliance with this order, the building will be taken by me by force, and you and all concerned with you will be held responsible for any life lost or any damage done by order Tom Ennis OC 2nd Eastern Division. The ultimatum was given, there was no response, and shortly after 4 o'clock on the morning of the 28th of June, the forecourts is attacked. And these are the newspaper headlines. This is a special edition of the Evening Echo that was released, basically telling the people of Dublin what you're waking up to is another war. Now, the anti-treaty who were in the forecourts, that lack of preparation, they are very open and honest about this later. Ernie O'Malley, who is one of the executive that is in the forecourts at this time, and he sums it up literally, they did not utilise that time to prepare and defend the building properly. And what he says in the Singing Flame, communications between the blocks within the open, the Dome area was cut off from the headquarters block, the latter from the records office, and the records office, the public records office, is where the orderly section was, which was manned by the youngest group, ex-FINA members. A big problem Sean Lamass had with that, because he felt they were too young to be in there, and that was where the munitions factory was. And he continues, the space was covered with rifle and machine gun fire. One man was hit as he crossed behind me, Paddy O'Brien, who is the commanding officer but really isn't in charge, because I do believe that as soon as the first shell went into that building, Paddy O'Brien would have ordered the public records office to be blown up and evacuate the building. Every time he tries to be proactive, Rory O'Connor, Liam Mellows, they overrule him. He is telling them to get out of the building, and they see it that if they leave the building, they are abandoning the Republic. So you have Paddy O'Brien's hands being tied literally at every corner. And what he says, Paddy O'Brien and I found men to work on a sandbag barricade, but there were not enough bags to make a covered bulletproof passage between the blocks. And we do all know that they used the ledgers to barricade the windows. Now, what was the response from the other members of the Dublin Brigade? Because you do have a large group of the Dublin Brigade in the forecourts, but you do have a massive number of anti-treaty IRA that are on the outside. And Sean Prendergast, who is a member of the 1st Battalion, well, he pretty much sums up the response of maybe what a lot of people felt, in that he and his comrades were at the cinema when word came through that the forecourts was going to be attacked. And you can see here from his witness statements, they thought actually this was a joke. They could not believe that this was actually happening. And then there's a scramble, and then they're deployed to all of these positions around the city centre, in and around town. But as we see in a few moments, they don't occupy the correct positions. But you can see it blatantly from Prendergast's statement there. Literally, they were shocked by it. They thought it was a joke. So for 3 days, the forecourts was bombarded, and the mutineer, the armoured car, that does act, it is a saviour, a lifeline for the anti-treaty IRA, but then that is taken out of action, and you then have the encirclement of the forecourts beginning. Simon Donnelly, who is in the forecourts, and this is his account that was held in the National Library, and what he says, this is nearing the end of the attack on the forecourts, and what he says is that things are busy all Thursday night and early on Friday morning. Enemy launched a very heavy artillery attack on 3 posts of the building, supported up by all other arms. One gun was moved in the 18-pounder to Wine Tavern Street Bridge, about 100-yard range, and protected by a fleet of armoured cars. Another was planted at Green Street at the rear of the courts, and a third gun. So it has been said that 2 guns were used, but actually 3 guns were in play against the forecourts, and that was from the direction of Bridge Street. The enemy authorities had apparently made up its mind to destroy the building and its garrison, as they realised the men were prepared to see the job through. The bombardment continued for many hours. About 11 a.m, incendiary bombs thrown into the GHQ block, in which was the chemical shop, took fire owing to the inflammable substance in the building. Orders were issued to all men to retire to the other side of the course, that is the portion next to the quay. They got over by means of a tunnel which had been dug under the road. I was directed to see this portion of the building clear, and myself and Father Dominic were the last to leave it. Shortly after GHQ block had been cleared, a terrific explosion occurred which shook the building to its foundations. A large quantity of explosives, some say as much as 2 tons, was exploded by the fire, and roofs, windows, walls were falling in all directions. So there we have Donnelly's account, who was in the building at that time. But then we go back to Pádraig O'Connor, who was actually one of the first of the Free State troops into the building. So a breach is made on the Church Street side. Joe Leonard was the other person that was leading the other group in. And Pádraig O'Connor pretty much was lucky to be alive, because he is caught up in that explosion. And here is what he says: that in a short time it was observed that the block I was about to attack was on fire, and that the fire was rapidly spreading. I received, so literally he gets into the complex, this is before the Public Records Office goes up. I received in return an order to attack immediately. I stood for a moment to give orders to the sergeant standing just inside the door. The block was blazing fiercely, the flames reeling across 25 to 35 yard gap that separated us. The heat inside the records office was unbearable. I had only started to instruct the sergeants when an immense explosion rocked the building. The building shook and the men were lifted off their feet and sent spinning around. This I could sense and see as I was propelled skyward with the sergeant. When I recovered and scrambled to my feet, the world was blacked out. I called out an order to evacuate the building. I was appalled as our men staggered out, blinded with dust and smoke, and in many cases covered in blood from cuts received from glass. And it is amazing that there were not all of them were killed in that explosion. But that's the first of 2 major explosions that happened on the 30th of June 1922. And the Forecourts garrison, they have no option but to surrender. And what was really tragic about June 1922 is that a lot of men that are in there had been in there in April 1916, including Padder Breslin and so on. So they do agree to surrender. The arms, many of them, are destroyed in the Forecourts, and they're lined up, and then they are brought to Smithfield, to Jemisin's distillery. But the other positions had been occupied by the anti-treaty forces because the word had gone out, and then focus shifts to the block and the area surrounding it. So the block is literally that block of buildings from the Gresham Hotel down to what's now the Burger King on O'Connell Street. And the anti-treaty IRA had left there from Barry's Hotel. A small detachment was sent under Sean Dowling. They occupied the buildings, the larger group come behind them, and then they tunnelled through each building, linking them all up to become a big block. But they weren't the only buildings that the anti-treaty forces occupied. Here you see a list of some of the places they were in. They're in Findlayers, they're in Moran's Hotel, and also Hughes Hotel in Talbot Street. They're all the way over in Ainger Street. They're in the Swan Hotel. They're in Harcourt Street. They are everywhere. But crucially, they take over the wrong side of O'Connell Street, because the National Army forces, they take the buildings that are on the side of the GPO, and that cuts the link between the block and the forecourt. So it's very difficult for Oscar Traynor to send people to relieve or send help to those in the forecourts. And I suppose we look back to 1916 and what the British did in encircling the GPO and isolating that building. You have similar methods here, because rather than attacking the block directly, the National Army go around, they come in behind, and they start with the attacks on Hughes and Moran's Hotel in at the junction at Talbot Street, and they bring in the armoured trains. They are put along the railway, and they unleash a very focused attack on Hughes and Moran's Hotel, and one by one the anti-treaty outposts begin to fall until eventually the circle gets smaller and smaller and smaller. smaller. Now, we have many, many accounts, thanks to military archives and the pension files, of people who are actually in not just the forecourts, but in those other outposts. And a huge thanks to Las Fallon for pointing this one out to me of Marie MacDonald, who served with her future husband, Austin, in the Hammond. Now, she's between the Hammond and the YMCA. She's being called back to every building. And she talks about the duties that she was involved in, first aid, looking after people. But what she says in her pension file is all she's worried about was seeing her husband, or future husband, Austin. She was always worried about it being taken away from him, because although she was prepared to die, she wants to die with Austin. Thankfully, the two of them didn't die. They did survive the fighting, and they went on to have a long married life together. But this is just one of many accounts of many women that were in the area, and we know that Union's grandmother was there as well. But here we have, or we can see, the way the National Army advanced and tried to take over, or their approach towards taking over the block. And here we have the 18-pounders. They're brought from the forecourts up to Henry Street, and they're put at the junction of Henry Street and Nelson's Pillar. You have the armoured cars then that are sent in front of them. And the photograph on the right, I do love that photograph, because it's a very, very sinister photograph, and you wonder, actually, did any of those soldiers get shot soon after that photograph was taken? Because during the fighting between the 1st and the 5th of July in the block, you have many times when they think there is a ceasefire and the National Army troops advance, but it's not a ceasefire, and when they get close to the Gresham or they get close to the Granville, they are open fire on. So my thoughts when I see that photograph is, did any of those soldiers live or survive? Were they shot, and did they get back to their units safely? And here we see the damage that was done in O'Connell Street, thanks to the 18-pounders, thanks to that encircling movement, and also the armoured cars, because they are brought into play. And the way they use them to get really close to the block is that they go in sort of, one armoured car would drive so far and have the covering fire, it would stop. Then it would be followed by the next armoured car. So you have this stop starting until they really get close to the block in the end. But you can see it is massive damage. And what starts off as a big, big outpost is getting smaller and smaller and smaller until eventually it is one position, the Granville. And here you have a small garrison left under the command of Cattle Oscar Traynor, De Valera, Countess Markovich. They had all left days earlier to link up with other units outside. And Cattle like he did in 1916, he lets them all go. He tells the remaining garrison to go. By this time, the National Army are at the back door of the Granville Hotel. They are in Thomas Lane, right behind it. The small garrison come out. The National Army soldiers are there. They're wondering where Brewitt is. He is seen. He is called on to surrender. The soldiers are ordered to aim and fire, but aim low so as not to kill him. But it takes one bullet. One bullet is all that it takes. What British bullets and grenades could not do in 1916. It takes one bullet fired by a fellow Irishman to take down Cattle. He was mortally wounded. The bullet hit ephemeral artery. Nurse Linda Cairns is there, many others, and he is taken to the Mater Hospital. A day or two later, it was seen that he may recover, but then he succumbed to his wounds and died on the 7th of July 1922. And with that bullet, with that shot, the battle for Dublin ended. But the fighting in Dublin continued right up to the end of the Civil War and beyond. But I can't end on that story because it is too tragic, and we have heard so many tragic stories today. If I find a good news story, I will run with it, and I've got two, and I'm just going to end on them. Bringing you back to Pádraig O'Connor and Paddy Rigney, best friends, War of Independence, where you saw one, you always saw the other on opposite sides in the Civil War. When the garrison surrendered, Pádraig O'Connor is in Smithfield. He sees Paddy Rigney, his friend, as a prisoner, and he decides, not for the only time in this period, that he would save his friend Paddy Rigney. He leaves the door open in Jemieson's distillery, gets word to Paddy Rigney, get out, save yourself. Paddy Rigney tells Ernie O'Malley, Sean Lamass, and a few others, and they all walk out and they go on to fight another day. And then, while this country was literally tearing itself apart, there was a young couple who are setting out on their married life together, and we have a wedding on the 28th of June 1922 in St Andrew's Church in Suffolk Street, and it's the wedding between Henry Cecil Bernardo and Helen MacDonald, and it made the newspapers because while the couple were getting married in St Andrews, a few doors away from St Andrews was the Anti-Treaty IRA's publicity office in Suffolk Street, and their wedding cars were stolen, most likely by the Anti-Treaty IRA. It did make the newspapers, but as Mr. Bernardo said in the newspapers, that, he says, Mr. Bernardo and his wife said to the Daily Mail reporter, "We were married under a big bombardment. Guns were firing all the time. We are quite happy. We're leaving for London tonight." And that is the Bernardo. He was the nephew of Thomas Bernardo, and he then went on to run Bernardo's Furriers. So, as I said, a country literally tearing itself apart and a young couple starting their life out together. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Liz. I've heard of shotgun weddings, but this is the first field gun wedding that I've come across.